Hey there, John Bell here. Promise Finally was included in the ES 2018 spec. In this video, we'll dig into what Promise Finally is and how to use it. Promise Finally is a new method that was added to the Promise prototype. The use case for this, as outlined in the TC39 proposal, was essentially cleanup. So Promise Finally has existed for a long time in a lot of libraries like Bluebird. So this spec actually makes it standard for browser implementations and things like that. So what we'll look at is how we use Promise Finally. So in short, Promise Finally is a method that runs after a promise is either resolved or rejected. So in any case, once a promise is finished, the finally method will be run last. So the most common use case here would probably be, for example, if you're firing off an asynchronous request and you have a loading spinner that you show and you want to disable that loading spinner whether or not the promise is successful or is rejected. In any case, you want to make sure that that loading spinner is cleaned up. So the first thing we can do is we'll just create a little function here called app. And then inside there, what we'll do is we'll call console log. Actually, let's create a little variable called isLoading, and we'll set that to true so that our loading spinner is showing. And then we will console log that variable here using template literals. That way we can see as the execution happens when our promise fires off and when different logs happen. So this is essentially the first thing. As soon as our function is called, it's going to console log this, because the next thing we want to do is actually create a little dummy promise method that we have, and we'll just call it getData. And what getData will do is it will return a promise that we will set a timeout in so that we can fake kind of what an asynchronous request would feel like. And what we'll do is set timeout. And then we will set that for just 2.5 seconds. And then we need to, oh, there we go. That's what I needed. So the next thing we'll do is we'll call that promise inside our app component. And then when we get a response, we'll console log that response. And then if we get an error, we'll console log the error. And then finally, no pun intended, well, pun intended, we'll set isLoading to false, and then we'll console log that variable again. We'll say isLoading, and then display what that is. Format that, save it. Oh, we need to call our app. So you can see isLoading is true. It waits 2.5 seconds. It calls loading or loaded, and it sets loading to false. So what happens now if our promise rejects instead of resolve? And we'll say rejected. So we can refresh. And again, our finally method gets called regardless of whether the promise was successful or failed. So it's a really great way to just hook in, clean up any side effects or anything that needs to be cleaned up. And the last thing to cover here is the support. So for example, if you're using Babel for your project, feel free to use Promise Finally. There is a polyfill that does exist. There's also other implementations in libraries like Bluebird, Q, the polyfill. There it is. Get the polyfill on NPM, exists right here. Promise Finally is heavily used. So that's all there is to Promise Finally. If you liked this video, if it was helpful, mash that subscribe button down in the bottom, and I'll see you in the next one.